Subnautica 2 is immensely anticipated at #1 on Steam database for most wishlisted games, and the release date is coming soon, and we now have the official PC system requirements. Now, in and of themselves, they're not too offensive, but if you've been playing the first game, which had these system requirements, then you will probably need to make sure your system will be ready for Subnautica 2. The original game ran on integrated graphics on an ancient Intel CPU, and that's all it required to at least get into the game. Now we're running on a much newer game, and it's in Unreal Engine 5, which is not known to be the most performant engine of all time. Now, given Unreal Engine 5 game specs, seeing recent games like Lego Batman system requirements asking for frame gen just to hit 30 FPS, well, okay, well, I mean, on the minimum spec, but anyway, the point is, this seems less offensive than that. But it is asking for a GTX 1660 to get 1080p low at 30 frames per second, which is a huge step up compared to the first game, but that game is older and we're moving to newer graphics, newer engine, etc. Just saying, keep an eye out, even if you've been playing the old game just fine. Now, so what does this mean for you if you don't have one of these GPUs? So, I recommend taking a look at the Tech Power Up Relative Performance chart because it has most GPUs in it, and you can just kind of scroll up and down. So if we set that 1660 as the baseline for what does it take to get 1080p low settings at 30 FPS. By the way, the system requirement chart doesn't mention upscaling, but that doesn't always mean it's not relying on it, so that's a bit of a caveat. But anyway, that's this baseline. So the 5500 XT was listed as the AMD card in that same tier, which is within, 88% of the performance of the GTX 1660 on average. In some games, they can be, one faster than the other, but generally the 1660 is a little bit faster, but they're in a similar ballpark. So this is at least a reasonable pairing. Now, if you have something like a 1650 Super or a 6500 XT or an RX 580 or even a GTX 1060 6GB version, you're not too far off. Now, on some of these weaker GPUs, though, you do need to keep an eye on the VRAM because it is specifically stating that you would like 6 gigabytes of VRAM minimum in order to run the game even at low settings. So if you're below that, there's some question marks on the kind of experience that you might have. Now, so those kind of match up. So I'll link this in the video description. You kind of have an idea of, what that's going to get you and where yours falls, close to that. Are you like on a 1070, which is a little bit more powerful, or 1660 Super, just a little bit more powerful? 3050 is kind of in this ballpark. Now, if we go to the recommended, which is for, interestingly, 1440p medium, a lot of games stick to 1080p for their recommended specs. So I thought it was interesting that this is targeting 1440p, but once again, it could be hiding some amount of upscaling, DLSS, FSR, TSR, XeSS, something like that, and just not mentioning it. So I'm just going to hold out that, a lot of times Unreal Engine 5 is relying on upscaling, and not every system's requirement chart makes that clear. Anyway, it is stating 1440p output at least at medium settings, 60 FPS on an RTX 3070 or an RX 6700 XT. And this is, a little more powerful than what you would expect from like a PS5. So with that in mind, that I think makes sense. If the PS5 version was targeting like 1080p or 1440p native, maybe with some upscaling on top of it, then that's that. Also, these are a reasonable pairing from similar specs-wise. Now, so what does that mean it takes to jump all the way from 1080p low to 1440p medium and from 30 FPS to 60 FPS? Well, just sticking to the same settings and resolution and doubling the frame rate, you would expect to double the GPU performance. And we're also increasing resolution and graphic settings from 1080p to 1440p and from low to medium. So you would actually expect them to ask for a more than doubling of GPU performance. So let's see where that gets us. So 1660 as the baseline, that's the 1080p low 30 FPS. Now we can scroll up and maybe you'll spot your GPU along the way, and we'll go until we get to that 6700 XT and 3070. Notice the 6700 XT is a little more than double the performance. And then if we keep scrolling up, the 3070 is a little bit more powerful than that. So we could set this as the baseline now, and we can take a look at that. So with the 3070 falling within, 16% or so of the performance as less VRAM, but usually a little bit more raw performance. Now, So that's that. So does this make sense? Well, one thing to keep in mind with PC system requirements is that usually by 30 FPS and 60 FPS, these aren't like benchmark numbers where they're being super precise. They're giving you like a ballpark of performance. So if this was, the minimum was in a 30-ish FPS, we're now getting 60-ish FPS. So that can absorb some of the I would expect it to be more like 250% or 300% since it was moving up resolution and graphic settings and doubling the frame rate. So I just don't expect PC system requirements to be exactly that precise, is I guess what I'm saying. Now, one thing I wish they did here is give you an idea of what it would take for 1080p 60 FPS at medium settings. But what we could at least say is somewhere in between the minimum and recommended. And then also you could look at what if we just took the minimum and doubled it? That would at least be getting you to 60-ish FPS. So what if we actually do that for a second? So I'm going to go back and set that 1660 as the baseline again. And we'll say if we get to about double the performance, that would be around 60 FPS at the same settings. Now that's already jumping to almost a 6700 XT, but if we just reduce that a little bit, maybe cards like a 5050, ARC B580, RTX 2080, even a 2070 Super or something like that, that's probably what you'd be needing for about 1080p 60 FPS. Maybe at least at the low settings. But this is also another reason why there could be some upscaling going on here where maybe this 1440p medium actually has DLSS quality involved, and maybe it's closer to an internal resolution of a little under 1080p, but then you have the upscale. So like I said, there could be some details hidden here. Now, if we move up to the ultra spec, which is for 1440p at high graphics settings, they're asking for another pretty big jump and still staying at 60 FPS. So first of all, let's look at the amount of GPU horsepower that they're asking for, although I'll also mention that their system RAM is jumping every time too. The minimum was at 12, recommended was at 16, and I think a lot of people with a modern PC would have at least 16, although if you've been playing Subnautica 1 and on an older system, maybe not, so do keep an eye on that. And they're now jumping all the way up to 32 gigabytes of system memory. And while there are a few games that do need more than 16, even if you close out other background tasks, it's pretty rare. So it's possible that they're overstating the need for the 32 gigabytes of system memory, but that's just me speculating. Anyway, they're jumping all the way up to a 4070 or 6900 XT. So let's set that 3070 as the baseline and see what kind of a jump they're asking for. Because they're staying at 1440p 60 FPS and just going from medium settings to high settings. So you wouldn't expect a massive jump, and they're jumping from a 3070 up to a 4070. So how big of a jump is that? So 3070 is the baseline. Maybe you'll spot your GPU in here. 4070 is about a 30% jump. So honestly, going from medium settings to high settings at the same resolution, a 30% jump, especially on Unreal Engine 5, where sometimes medium turns off or at least significantly down some things like Lumen or Nanite and things like that. I think a 30% jump is actually pretty reasonable. So that does seem to make sense to me. They're also pairing up the 4070 alongside a 6900 XT. So does that make sense? Well, 4070 is actually pretty close in performance to a 6900 XT. So that does make sense as a pairing. The 6900 XT has more VRAM, but as long as you're not going past needing 12, which is what the 4070 has, then that doesn't give you any actual advantages. It only matters if you're needing more. And they are specifically calling out 12 gigabytes of VRAM for 1440p high settings. So it's possible 8 gigabyte cards that have this performance level could struggle, and there are some. Like a 5060 Ti 8 gigabyte is at least ballpark levels of 4070 performance. It's a little bit weaker, but we're not way off. And yet, it could end up struggling here if you go by them specifically stating 12 gigabytes of VRAM here. Now, if you want to jump up to 4K high settings, staying at 60 FPS, they're bumping up to 16 gigabytes of GPU memory, and they're jumping up from a 4070 to a 5070 Ti or a 7900 XTX. So what does that pairing look like? So the 4070 up to a 5070 Ti is a noticeable jump again. It's 43%. Although, honestly, jumping from 1440p to 4K, I mean, 43%, it's not way off. And again, these aren't specific benchmark results, but like I said, there could be some hidden upscaling involved in these this chart that they're not really showing us. So with that caveat, they're asking for about a 43% jump. And is a 5070 Ti in the ballpark of 7900 XTX? And the answer is yes. If we set the 5070 Ti as the baseline, then the 7900 XTX is generally within a few percent of the performance if we're not talking heavy ray tracing and mostly looking at rasterized performance here. So overall, their GPU pairings generally kind of make sense. Similar performance between the AMD and NVIDIA alternatives, and the amount of power they're asking for jumping up relative to the previous settings mostly makes sense as well. So the biggest things I would say that I would caution you as maybe just being placeholders in the chart and not actually being necessary is whether or not you actually need 32 gigabytes of system memory. A lot of times you don't. And then also the CPUs. So it is the case sometimes that Unreal Engine 5 can be pretty heavy on the CPU, but these seem like a bit overkill for just hitting 60 FPS to me. So oftentimes system requirements charts, I think at least, I'm not in game development, are probably based on test systems that they've been using, and they might have low-end PCs, kind of mid-range PCs, higher-end PCs, and then like super high-end PCs. And they might not necessarily be mixing and matching CPUs and GPUs to stress exactly what you need on that end. Now, I could be wrong on that, but in other words, I think sometimes system requirement charts are really telling you what kind of GPU you need, and then they kind of overkill the CPU that's paired with that, and it might not actually be needed, which is why in benchmarking, which is different than this, oftentimes we would pair a CPU with the highest end GPU and then run at a low resolution in order to check what CPU can actually reach that performance, and I'm not sure that's what this is telling us. So if you're worried about the CPUs here, I would say these are asking for kind of big CPUs to hit 60 FPS, and it's possible that you do actually need them, but sometimes that's overstated in these charts because they just happen to pair that with the GPU. But I don't know, guys. So that is the one place where I'm like, I really doubt you need a 7900X3D or a 14900K just to hit 60 FPS at 4K, because scaling up resolution does not usually significantly increase the burden on the CPU. So that seems like a bit of nonsense. But otherwise, from a GPU perspective, this chart seems somewhat reasonable. Like I said, if you've been playing the first game, though, there's a good chance you're going to need a much higher-end PC if you haven't upgraded recently for a newer game or anything like that. As a little bit of other just kind of Subnautica 2 news while we're at it, there had been a lot of speculation about Unknown Worlds no longer working with Krafton as the publisher when they were removed from the Steam page a while back, but Unknown Worlds has confirmed that Krafton is still co-publishing Subnautica 2. Anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comment section, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.